The Harrington estate had never been so quiet. The grand halls, usually filled with the hum of laughter, parties, and business deals, now echoed with the heavy silence of grief. Margaret Harrington, the family matriarch, had passed away. For decades, she had been the glue that held the family together. A woman of grace and unshakable strength. Her death left not only a void but also an uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. Her 4 children gathered under the same roof for the first time in years. Edward Harrington, the eldest. Polished and commanding. Always treated as Margaret's golden child. Daniel Harrington, the second-born. Overlooked in business matters but brilliant in his own quiet way. Rebecca Harrington, fiery and outspoken, who had long battled against Edward's authority. Sophie Harrington, the youngest, gentle and kind, but often dismissed as too soft for the ruthless world of the Harrington Empire. At the funeral, Edward stood tall by the casket, accepting condolences with a tight smile, as if he were already assuming his role as the family's new head. Rebecca watched him with narrowed eyes. Daniel kept silent, his mind working behind his glasses. Sophie wept quietly, clutching their mother's rosary. But underneath the grief, there was one question that all of them avoided: what would the will say? Because Margaret Harrington's estate wasn't just money, it was legacy, reputation, and power. And everyone knew Edward would stop at nothing to claim it all. The family gathered inside the oak-paneled study, where the lawyer, Mr. Collins, sat behind a polished mahogany desk. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the light as he adjusted a thick stack of legal documents. "Thank you all for coming," he said softly. "Your mother loved you deeply, and her final wishes are written here." The siblings exchanged tense glances. Edward sat confidently at the head of the table, as if he already knew the outcome. Daniel sat opposite him, his arms folded, while Rebecca leaned back in her chair, trying to mask her impatience. Sophie sat nearest the lawyer, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Collins began. "To my children, I leave the following: to my eldest son, Edward Harrington, I leave 70% of the family estate, including majority ownership of Harrington Enterprises." The words rang like a hammer in the room. Rebecca's chair screeched as she shot up. 70%? That's absurd. What about the rest of us? Mr. Collins raised a hand, urging patience. "To Daniel, I leave 10% of the estate. To Rebecca, I leave 10% as well. To Sophie, my youngest, I leave the family's summer home in Maine and the remaining 10%. The room erupted. "This is a joke," Rebecca snapped. Daniel's voice was colder. Mother would never divide things this unfairly. Sophie, tears streaming, whispered, She loved us all. She wouldn't do this." Edward, however, leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at his lips. Mother knew who could handle the responsibility. "Clearly, she trusted me more than the rest of you." Rebecca's eyes burned. "Or maybe you made sure of that." The air grew heavier. For the first time, the siblings considered the unthinkable: had Edward manipulated the will? Mr. Collins cleared his throat nervously. "These are the documents as they were submitted. If you wish to contest, you'll need proof." Daniel's mind was already racing. Proof. That word stuck like a nail in his brain. If Edward had forged, tricked, or coerced their mother, there had to be a way to uncover it. Rebecca slammed her fist on the desk. "Mark my words, Edward, if you cheated us, I'll burn your empire to the ground." Edward didn't flinch. He only smiled wider. "You'll try." The siblings left the study with storm clouds hanging over them. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't about inheritance anymore, it was about dignity. justice, and exposing the darkest secret of their family. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing inside the Harrington estate. Rain lashed against the windows as Rebecca paced the living room like a caged lioness. "He planned this," she hissed. "I know Edward. He's been scheming since we were kids. Mother never would have given him 70%. Not after what happened last year." Daniel looked up from his notebook. He had been scribbling timelines, notes, and questions since the reading of the will. His mind worked like a detective's, piecing together patterns no one else noticed. "What happened last year?" Sophie asked, her voice hesitant. Rebecca stopped pacing. Her eyes darted to Sophie, then back to Daniel. "You didn't tell her?" Daniel sighed. "Mother had doubts about Edward. She confided in me. Said she suspected Edward was hiding money from the company's accounts. Millions, Rebecca. She was considering rewriting her will to balance things out." Sophie's face went pale. "Then, why didn't she?" "That's the point," Rebecca snapped. "She must have. But Edward got to her. Or worse." Her voice trailed off, heavy with implication. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "We need proof. If Edward forged the will, there will be inconsistencies. Handwriting, signatures, dates. I'll start digging into the legal records." Rebecca's eyes gleamed with fire. "And I'll dig into Edward himself. He thinks he's untouchable, but I know where he keeps his skeletons." Sophie sat back, wringing her hands. She hated conflict, hated watching her siblings tear into each other. But the thought of Edward smugly claiming their mother's legacy lit something inside her. She whispered, almost to herself. Maybe Mother tried to warn us. Maybe her death wasn't as natural as they say." The room froze. Daniel looked sharply at Sophie. "What are you suggesting?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice steadied. "I was there the night before she died. She wanted to talk to me, but Edward wouldn't let me in. He said she was too weak. Hours later, she was gone." Rebecca's blood boiled. "That bastard." The siblings stared at one another, a silent pact forming in that charged moment. It was no longer just about money. It was about truth. It was about their mother. And if Edward really had orchestrated this betrayal, then they weren't just fighting for inheritance. They were fighting for justice. The following days turned the Harrington estate into a battlefield of silence and secrets. Edward carried himself like a king, striding through the halls with an arrogance that made Rebecca want to scream. But behind his composed exterior, the other three siblings were moving like shadows, each step drawing them closer to the truth. Daniel's path. Daniel spent long nights in his study, laptop open. Stacks of files scattered across his desk. He hacked into the company's archives, pulling financial statements, board meeting records, and drafts of legal documents. What he found didn't sit right. Dates didn't align. Margaret's supposed last amendment to the will had been filed only 3 weeks before her death. Yet Daniel clearly remembered his mother telling him she hadn't spoken to her lawyer in months. Even stranger, the handwriting on one of the drafts looked off. Slightly shaky, inconsistent. Daniel compared it to her old letters. "Someone forged this," he whispered into the dim light. Rebecca's path. Meanwhile, Rebecca wasn't playing by the rules. She slipped into Edward's private office one night when he was out. The scent of cigars and expensive cologne lingered in the room. She rummaged through drawers, scanned shelves, and searched for anything incriminating. Her heart stopped when she found a locked drawer. With a swift tug and a hairpin, she pried it open. Inside lay documents, bank statements, offshore accounts, receipts of large transfers under shell companies. Rebecca smirked. Got you. But tucked beneath the papers was something even more chilling, a prescription bottle with Margaret's name on it. The pills inside were half full, but the date was 3 years past expiration. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Why would he keep this? Sophie's struggle. While Daniel and Rebecca dug for evidence, Sophie wrestled with her conscience. She visited her mother's old friends, the housekeeper, even the family doctor. Everyone said the same thing. Margaret had seemed healthy, too healthy, to die so suddenly. One evening, Sophie sat alone in her mother's old room, clutching the rosary beads Margaret had given her. A faint memory stirred. Margaret had whispered something to her weeks before dying. If anything happens, don't trust the papers. Trust your heart. Sophie shivered. Could her mother have known? The clash. When the siblings reconvened, Daniel laid out the forged documents. Rebecca revealed the offshore accounts and expired pills. And Sophie shared her haunting memory. The air thickened. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning into one horrifying possibility. Edward had manipulated the will, hidden millions, and maybe, just maybe, played a role in their mother's untimely death. Rebecca slammed her fist on the table. He's not just greedy. He's dangerous. Daniel nodded grimly. We need undeniable proof. Something we can take to court. Sophie whispered, and what if court isn't enough? What if he's already destroyed everything? Rebecca's eyes hardened. Then we destroy him. For the first time, the three siblings stood united. Not for money. Not for power. But for the truth. And Edward Harrington had no idea what storm was about to crash down on him. Edward Harrington sat in his glass-walled office on the top floor of Harrington Enterprises. The city skyline stretched before him like a kingdom he believed was rightfully his. He sipped his whiskey, savoring the burn. On paper, he had it all: control of the empire, respect from the board, and his siblings under his thumb. Yet, something gnawed at him. Daniel's silence. Rebecca's cold stares. Sophie's unusual distance. They weren't surrendering, not this time. Edward leaned back, muttering, they're plotting something. The dinner table test. That night, he hosted a dinner at the estate, insisting all siblings attend. The grand dining hall was lit with golden chandeliers, but the atmosphere was icy. Edward raised a toast. To Mother. May her legacy live on through me. I mean, through us. Rebecca's fork clattered against her plate. Don't twist her words, Edward. Mother's legacy doesn't belong to you alone. Edward smirked, sipping his wine. It belongs to the strongest. That's why she trusted me. Daniel's eyes flicked up. Or why you needed to forge it. The table froze. Sophie gasped softly, her hands trembling. Edward's expression hardened. Careful, Daniel. Those are dangerous accusations. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice sharp. And what about the offshore accounts? Or the expired pills in your office drawer? For the first time, Edward's mask cracked. His knuckles tightened around the wine glass. You've been snooping. Daniel's lips curved slightly. And finding. Edward forced a laugh, trying to regain control. You think you can outsmart me? I've built this empire while you all sat back. You're nothing without me. But inside, his mind raced. They had evidence, maybe not enough yet, but enough to threaten him. The boardroom whisper. The next morning, Edward tried to get ahead of the storm. Rebecca's impulsive, Daniel's weak. And Sophie's too fragile to handle business matters, he declared confidently. They'll try to contest the will. But I assure you, gentlemen, the company is safe with me. But behind closed doors, whispers spread. The board members weren't blind. They had heard rumors of shady accounts, questionable signatures, and the matriarch's sudden death. Cracks were forming, not just in the family, but in Edward's empire. The warning. That evening, as Edward returned to his car in the company garage, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. In neat handwriting, it read, "We know what you did. The truth always wins." Edward crushed the note in his fist, his jaw tightening. His siblings weren't just suspects anymore, they were a threat. And Edward Harrington never let threats live long. Edward Harrington wasn't the type to wait for enemies to strike first. If Daniel, Rebecca, and Sophie wanted a war, he would make sure it ended before it began. He called in his private investigator, a wiry man named Grant who specialized in digging up dirt. "Find me everything," Edward ordered. "Every weakness, every debt, every secret my siblings are hiding. And if you can't find one, make one." Grant smirked. "Understood." Edward leaned back in his leather chair, a predator ready to pounce. "By the time I'm done, they'll destroy themselves." Targeting Daniel. The first strike came at Daniel. Late one night, police stormed his apartment, waving a warrant. They found files on Edward's financial accounts. Documents that looked stolen. Even doctored evidence suggesting Daniel had embezzled money from the company. Daniel was dragged into questioning, though he insisted he was framed. The damage was done, headlines painted him as the disgraced middle Harrington's son. Edward watched the news with a glass of wine in hand, whispering, "One down. Rebecca's scandal." Next was Rebecca. A tabloid broke the story. Rebecca Harrington, caught in affair with married senator. Photographs, clearly staged, splashed across the front pages. Her reputation as a fierce, outspoken advocate was torn to shreds overnight. Rebecca stormed into Edward's office, shoving the papers in his face. "You think this scares me?" she spat. "All you've done is prove me right, you're desperate." Edward leaned forward, smiling coldly. "Desperate people are dangerous, Rebecca. And I'm the most dangerous of all." Sophie's heartbreak. Sophie was the easiest target. Edward knew her weakness, trust. She received anonymous letters warning that Daniel and Rebecca were only using her to get their share. That they planned to cut her out once Edward was gone. Confused and torn, Sophie began to withdraw. The unity between the three siblings began to fracture. The illusion of victory. One evening, Edward stood by the fireplace, the flames flickering against his sharp features. Grant entered, handing him a folder. "It's done. Daniel's reputation is ruined, Rebecca's credibility is shot, and Sophie, well, she's doubting everything. You've isolated them perfectly." Edward smirked, lifting his glass. "Then the empire is mine. As it should be." But outside the study door, Sophie stood frozen, tears in her eyes. She had come to confront Edward, but instead, she heard the truth, his confession, his plan, his betrayal. Quietly, she stepped back into the shadows. For the first time, Sophie wasn't just the fragile little sister. She was the key. Sophie sat in her mother's old room, the faded floral wallpaper surrounding her like a ghost from the past. She clutched Margaret's rosary in her trembling hands, her mind replaying Edward's chilling words. "Then the empire is mine. As it should be." For years, Sophie had been the quiet one, the peacemaker, the one her siblings shielded. But now she realized something. Margaret had always known, gentleness wasn't weakness. It was strength waiting for the right moment. The reunion. The next morning, Sophie summoned Daniel and Rebecca to the summer house Margaret had left her. When they arrived, their faces carried exhaustion, Daniel from the legal attacks, Rebecca from the public scandal. "You both look like you've been beaten," Sophie said softly. Then, with surprising firmness, she added, "But Edward hasn't won." "Not yet." Daniel frowned. "Sophie, he's destroyed my reputation. I can't even walk into the company without whispers." Rebecca slammed her fist on the table. "And my career is in ruins. He's playing chess while we're stumbling in the dark." Sophie's voice cut through their despair. "Not anymore. I overheard him. He admitted everything, framing Daniel, planting the scandal, manipulating me. He confessed it all." Their heads snapped up. Daniel's eyes widened. "You heard him? Are you certain?" Sophie nodded. "Word for word. If we can get him to say it again, on record, we'll have the proof we need." Rebecca leaned forward, fire returning to her eyes. "So we set a trap for him. Use his arrogance against him." For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "Edward always underestimates us. Especially you, Sophie." Margaret's memory. That night, Sophie sat alone, thinking of her mother. Margaret had always told her, "Your voice is quiet, Sophie, but one day it will be the loudest in the room." Now she understood. Her mother had left her not just the summer house, but the responsibility of holding the family together. The little sister was no longer afraid. The plan. Together, the siblings devised a strategy. Sophie would confront Edward privately, drawing him into another victory speech. Daniel would plant hidden recording devices. Rebecca would gather allies, board members, lawyers, and even the press, ready to act the moment the truth was revealed. It was dangerous. If Edward discovered their plot, he could destroy them completely. But Sophie's voice was steady as she declared, "Mother trusted us to protect her legacy. This isn't about money anymore. It's about her. And I won't let Edward erase her truth." Rebecca placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Welcome to the fight, little sister." Daniel nodded. "This time, we don't lose." And in that candlelit room, for the first time since Margaret's death, the Harrington siblings stood united, not as rivals, but as warriors. The empire had belonged to Edward for too long. Now, the storm was coming for him. The Harrington estate's grand study was dimly lit, the fire casting long shadows across the room. Edward sat in his favorite leather chair, sipping brandy, his expression smug as ever. He had weathered storms before and believed he had already broken his siblings. That's when Sophie entered. Her usual soft presence was replaced by calm determination. She stood straighter, her eyes steady. Edward raised an eyebrow, amused. "Well, well. The little lamb walks into the wolf's den," he smirked. "What do you want, Sophie? To beg for scraps?" Sophie's voice was steady. "I want the truth." Edward chuckled. "The truth? The truth is simple. I won. Daniel is ruined. Rebecca is disgraced. And you, sweet Sophie, you'll eventually realize I'm the only family worth standing by." Sophie stepped closer. "Did you ruin them, Edward? Did you forge Mother's will? Did you," her voice caught, "have something to do with her death?" Edward's smirk widened. He leaned forward, his tone low and venomous. "Of course I did. Mother was going to cut me out. She doubted me. Me. The only one capable of running this empire. I couldn't allow her weakness to destroy everything. So yes, I made sure the will reflected what should have been mine. And your precious Daniel and Rebecca. They never stood a chance against me." His words dripped with pride, not regret. What Edward didn't know was that Daniel, sitting quietly in the adjoining hallway, was listening through a hidden microphone. And Rebecca, waiting outside with her phone, was streaming the confession straight to trusted allies, lawyers, journalists, even board members. Sophie held his gaze, her heart pounding but her face calm. "You always underestimated us, Edward. You thought we were too weak to fight you. But weakness isn't what you saw in us, it's what you mistook for patience." Edward's smirk faltered. At that moment, Rebecca and Daniel stepped into the room. Rebecca's eyes blazed with triumph, while Daniel held up the small recording device. "We've got everything," Daniel said. "Every word." Edward shot to his feet, his face twisting with rage. "You think this will destroy me? I am Harrington Enterprises. No one will believe you over me." Rebecca stepped closer, her voice sharp as steel. "They already do. Your empire isn't crumbling tomorrow, Edward. It's crumbling tonight." For the first time, Edward's confidence cracked. His siblings stood united before him, the empire he had stolen slipping from his grasp. And he realized his greatest mistake wasn't underestimating them. It was forgetting that blood ties cut both ways. The next morning, headlines exploded across the city. Edward Harrington exposed, forgery, fraud, and family betrayal. News channels ran clips of his recorded confession. Journalists swarmed outside Harrington Enterprises, demanding answers. Investors panicked, board members held emergency meetings. And Edward's once unshakable empire began to crumble in real time. The courtroom war. The siblings wasted no time. Their lawyers filed charges of forgery, fraud, and financial misconduct. In the courtroom, Edward still tried to project his old arrogance, standing tall in his expensive suit. "This is a family squabble," he sneered. "Nothing more than jealous siblings trying to steal what's rightfully mine." But Daniel rose to the stand with calm precision, presenting financial records Edward thought he had buried. Offshore accounts, altered signatures, illegal transfers. Rebecca followed, her fiery testimony laying bare Edward's manipulations. "He thinks power makes him untouchable. But today, power answers to truth." And then Sophie, the quiet sister, took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. "My mother told me once that the strongest voice in this family wasn't the loudest. Edward silenced us for years. But today, we speak for her. For justice. For the truth." The jury listened, the weight of her words undeniable. Edward's fall. When Edward was finally called to testify, his mask shattered. Cornered by evidence and his own recorded confession, he lashed out. "They're nothing without me. This family, this company, it exists because of me. Mother was weak, and so are they." His outburst sealed his fate. The courtroom saw not a leader, but a tyrant. The judge's gavel came down hard. Edward Harrington was stripped of control, facing years in prison for fraud and forgery. His empire was gone. The bittersweet victory. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Daniel, Rebecca, and Sophie stood together. Reporters shouted questions, but Sophie spoke softly, her voice carrying above the chaos. "This wasn't about money. This was about honoring our mother's legacy. Edward tried to take that from us. He failed." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Rebecca stood tall, her fire burning brighter than ever. For the first time, the siblings weren't rivals, they were united. But victory was bittersweet. They had reclaimed their dignity, their mother's true wishes, and the family's honor, but at the cost of their brother's downfall. As they walked away from the courthouse, Sophie whispered, "Blood ties never break. But sometimes, they bleed. The Harrington legacy lived on, but it would never be the same.